In the early months of 1939, Europe functioned as a connected system of borders, rail lines, ports, and trade routes. Agreements still existed on paper, embassies remained open, and shipping schedules continued to move coal, grain, and manufactured goods across the continent. Yet beneath these routines, the balance that had defined European security since the end of the previous war was shifting. Germany had already absorbed Austria and dismantled Czechoslovakia without triggering a continental military response. Each alteration adjusted the map slightly, but the larger effect was structural. Rail junctions changed hands. Industrial regions shifted alignment. Defensive calculations made in London and Paris required quiet revision. When German forces crossed into Poland in September 1939, the action was swift and coordinated. Armored divisions moved along prepared corridors while aircraft disrupted communication centers and rail hubs. The Polish defensive system, stretched along long frontiers, struggled to respond to concentrated movement. Within weeks, organized resistance collapsed. The Eastern territories were divided according to prior agreements between Berlin and Moscow. A state that had existed as a buffer between Germany and the Soviet Union disappeared from the European map. Its ports, railways, and grain supplies were redirected. For Britain, the fall of Poland did not produce immediate visible danger at home. The Channel remained calm. Merchant ships continued to arrive in Liverpool and Glasgow. Trains carried commuters into London each morning. Yet the continental landmass beyond the North Sea was becoming less stable. France, bound by alliance to Poland, had mobilized but undertaken limited offensive movement. The French army withdrew into a defensive posture behind the Maginot Line, a vast system of reinforced concrete fortifications stretching along the German frontier. Designed to prevent a direct assault, it represented a belief that defense could be engineered through static strength. This reliance on fixed defenses shaped the broader Allied disposition. French industry focused on sustaining large ground forces. Britain, separated by water, concentrated on its navy and air force. The British Expeditionary Force crossed the Channel in measured stages, establishing positions alongside French units in northern France. Camps were organized with methodical efficiency. Supply depots were mapped. Communication lines were laid. The expectation was not of rapid maneuver, but of endurance. Meanwhile, Germany reoriented its economy toward continuous mobilization. Factories operated on extended schedules. Synthetic fuel production expanded. Steel output increased. The integration of Austrian and Czech industrial capacity provided additional machinery and skilled labor. Rail networks across Central Europe were synchronized to support rapid troop movement. What appeared outwardly as separate political acts formed part of a single logistical structure. At sea, the pattern was equally methodical. The North Atlantic served as Britain's primary artery. Grain from Canada, meat from Argentina, oil from the Middle East, and raw materials from across the empire passed through defined shipping lanes. The Royal Navy maintained patrols across these routes, calculating convoy schedules according to distance and seasonal weather. German naval planners understood this dependency. Surface raiders and submarines were positioned not to challenge the Royal Navy. In Scandinavia, strategic calculations revolved around resources and access. Swedish iron ore traveled through Norwegian ports during winter months when the Baltic froze. Control of these northern corridors influenced steel production in Germany. The fjords of Norway also offered potential naval bases extending into the Atlantic approaches. These considerations remained abstract through the winter of 1939, yet staff officers in London and Berlin studied the same maps, marking distances between airfields and anchorages. Through the early phase of the war, often described later as a period of waiting, armies remained largely stationary along the Western Front. Soldiers maintained equipment, reinforced trenches, and conducted patrols. Civil administrations in Britain introduced blackout regulations and ration planning, but daily commercial life persisted. Newspapers printed shipping reports and commodity prices alongside war bulletins. The machinery of society continued to operate within familiar patterns. The stillness did not indicate stability. It reflected preparation. German planners evaluated the Ardennes forest, long considered unsuitable for large mechanized formations. French defenses were strongest along the direct border, weaker where terrain was assumed to provide natural protection. This assumption became a variable in a larger operational design. Roads were surveyed. Bridge capacities were measured. Fuel depots were calculated according to projected rates of advance. In April 1940, German forces moved into Denmark and Norway. Denmark capitulated quickly, providing airfields and control over the entrance to the Baltic Sea. In Norway, operations unfolded along an extended coastline. Naval engagements occurred in narrow fjords where geography constrained maneuver. Control of Norwegian ports extended Germany's reach toward the Atlantic. British attempts to intervene revealed the difficulty of operating far from established bases without air superiority. The Northern Sea lanes, once peripheral, became integrated into the broader contest for maritime control. These shifts tightened the perimeter around Britain. The continent from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees was aligning under German influence or occupation. The Low Countries remained neutral, but their flat terrain formed a corridor between Germany and northern France. British strategic planning relied on the assumption that the French army, supported by British divisions, would hold a defensive line long enough for economic pressure to weaken Germany over time. That assumption rested on coordinated logistics, uninterrupted sea supply, and the endurance of Allied industry. In May 1940, German forces initiated their western offensive. Armored units advanced through the Ardennes, crossing the Meuse River at points lightly defended. Speed replaced attrition as the defining characteristic of the campaign. Communications within the Allied command structure struggled to keep pace with rapid penetrations. The Maginot Line, formidable along the frontier, was bypassed rather than breached. French and British units repositioned repeatedly, attempting to form coherent lines amid continuous movement. As German divisions approached the Channel coast, the geographic reality of Britain's position became clearer. The island depended on ports across southern England for the arrival of food and fuel. It relied on industrial centers in the Midlands and shipyards along the Clyde and Tyne. These systems functioned through predictable flows of raw materials and finished goods. Any sustained interruption at sea would affect not only military capacity, but civilian provisioning. By early summer 1940, large portions of Western Europe were under German control. Airfields in France and the Low Countries shortened the distance to British cities. Submarine bases along the Atlantic coast extended operational range. The continental system that had once balanced multiple powers now tilted heavily toward a single center. Britain remained outside direct occupation, protected by water and fleet. Yet its security depended on assumptions that convoys could be escorted effectively, that industrial production could outpace losses, that air defense could prevent sustained disruption. The pressure accumulated not through spectacle, but through arithmetic. Tonnage of shipping versus submarine output. Aircraft production versus losses in combat. Fuel reserves measured against projected consumption. Each figure connected to another within a network of dependencies. Britain's geographic separation offered defense, but also imposed reliance on maritime continuity. As the summer advanced, the structure of European power had altered almost completely within a year. What had begun as a regional crisis in Poland evolved into a continental realignment. Britain stood as the remaining major opponent in Western Europe, its position defined less by immediate invasion than by the fragility of supply lines and industrial endurance. The island's security rested upon ships crossing open water, factories maintaining schedules, and defensive systems functioning without interruption. The surface of daily life remained orderly, but beneath it lay a system under increasing strain, balanced on calculations that would soon be tested. As spring turned toward early summer in 1940, the network that had supported Britain's position on the continent began to narrow. The campaign in Norway, conceived as a means of protecting northern sea routes and limiting German access to iron ore evolved into a prolonged contest fought along scattered coastal towns and fjord harbors. British, French, and Norwegian units operated across difficult terrain, dependent on long maritime supply lines. Equipment had to be landed over exposed docks or transferred by smaller craft where ports were damaged. Weather conditions in the North Atlantic complicated scheduling. Naval escorts were assigned to protect troop transports already stretched across wider commitments. German forces, operating from newly secured Danish airfields and coordinated naval detachments, maintained pressure along the Norwegian coastline. Air superiority shifted gradually in their favor. Each British reinforcement required additional escort vessels. Destroyers that might otherwise have guarded Atlantic convoys were redirected north. Fuel consumption rose. Maintenance cycles shortened. The campaign did not collapse in a single moment. Instead, positions were reassessed and withdrawn in stages. By early June, Allied troops were evacuated. Norway's ports and airfields fell under German control, extending the arc of influence closer to Britain's northern approaches. At the same time, the situation in Western Europe accelerated. The German advance through the Ardennes had reached the Channel coast, separating Allied armies in Belgium from the main body of French forces further south. The Low Countries, whose neutrality had once functioned as a buffer, were drawn into direct conflict. Belgian and Dutch defensive plans relied on river lines and fortified positions designed for limited delay. These systems were overtaken by coordinated ground and air operations that prioritized speed over siege. British divisions deployed alongside French and Belgian units found their lines of communication increasingly exposed. Supply columns navigating narrow roads encountered congestion as civilian refugees moved in the opposite direction. Fuel deliveries became uncertain. Ammunition stocks required careful allocation. Commanders received reports indicating rapid changes in frontline positions. Decisions were based on incomplete information transmitted through strained communication networks. Naval commitments expanded again during the evacuation from northern France. Merchant vessels, destroyers, and auxiliary craft were gathered to transport soldiers across the channel. The movement required coordination under persistent air attack. Ports along the southern English coast operated continuously, receiving troops and redistributing them inland. The immediate objective was extraction rather than reinforcement. Equipment left behind altered future calculations. Artillery, vehicles, and heavy machinery that had formed part of Britain's continental commitment were now inaccessible. France, still engaged along a wide front, reoriented its defenses toward the south and west. The Maginot Line remained largely intact, but its strategic relevance diminished as German forces maneuvered around it. French industrial regions in the north faced occupation. Rail networks that had once connected Allied supply routes were disrupted. British planners observed these changes not as isolated events, but as adjustments within a larger structure. Each lost port reduced staging options. Each captured airfield shortened the operational distance to British territory. Within Britain, administrative planning shifted accordingly. The assumption that major ground operations would be sustained on the continent gave way to preparations centered on home defense. Factories adjusted production priorities toward aircraft and coastal artillery. Naval schedules were revised to account for longer patrol areas. Convoy systems were reviewed in light of increased submarine access from Atlantic bases newly acquired by Germany. The contraction was visible in maps displayed within planning rooms. Areas previously shaded to indicate Allied control gradually changed designation. Lines of anticipated resistance were redrawn closer to the channel. Air reconnaissance reports identified construction along French and Belgian coastlines. Ports such as Cherbourg and Brest, once Allied logistical nodes, were assessed as potential submarine and air bases under German command. Economic calculations reflected similar compression. Britain's imports had always traveled through defined maritime corridors. With Norway occupied and the Low Countries under German control, northern and eastern approaches required additional surveillance. Merchant ships were routed further west before turning toward British ports, increasing travel time and fuel expenditure. Insurance rates rose. Shipyard output was directed toward replacing losses rather than expanding capacity. There were no singular declarations marking this shift. Government communiques reported developments in measured language. Civilian routines continued under rationing adjustments and blackout regulations. Yet within military departments, planning documents multiplied. Contingency scenarios once considered remote were now reviewed systematically. The defense of the British coastline required inventories of available artillery, troop numbers, and transport capability. Airfields were evaluated for dispersal capacity. Radar installations were extended along vulnerable stretches of coast. France's eventual armistice formalized what had already become operational reality. The coalition that had framed the war's opening months no longer functioned as a unified structure. Britain's position transformed from one component of a continental alliance to that of an isolated power, dependent on maritime resilience and air defense. The Channel, once a boundary between partners, became a frontier. Naval deployments reflected this new burden. Destroyer flotillas rotated between convoy escort, coastal patrol, and refitting with limited intervals. Repair yards operated without interruption. Submarine detection methods were refined through accumulated experience. Aircraft production schedules were recalculated to compensate for continental losses. Each adjustment aimed to maintain continuity rather than expand influence. The geographic contraction influenced industrial planning as well. Raw materials had to be secured through extended Atlantic routes. Storage facilities near ports were reinforced against potential air attack. Railway timetables prioritized military transport alongside essential civilian supply. The coordination between ministries intensified, linking economic management directly to defensive requirements. Through these developments, the transition from coalition warfare to an island's responsibility unfolded without abrupt transformation. It was a sequence of logistical revisions and territorial redefinitions. Britain's planners recalculated tonnage requirements, aircraft output, and troop distribution according to narrower margins. Strategic depth, once provided by continental allies, no longer existed. The buffer zones that had absorbed initial pressure were gone. By mid-1940, Britain's security depended on sustaining systems within compressed boundaries. Sea lanes required constant protection. Airspace demanded organized surveillance. Ground forces, reconstituted after evacuation, prepared for potential landings along southern coasts. The broader European structure had consolidated under opposing control, leaving Britain positioned at the edge of a continent reshaped within months. The contraction did not produce immediate visible transformation in daily life, yet its implications were embedded in routine adjustments. Ration books, fuel allocations, factory shifts, and convoy schedules all reflected the same reality. The strategic landscape had narrowed. The war, once dispersed across Allied fronts, now rested primarily on the endurance of an island state and the systems that sustained it. By the middle of 1940, the center of gravity shifted inward. With continental positions reduced and overseas commitments extended, Britain's capacity to continue the war rested increasingly on output measured in units, tons, and hours. Military planning documents began to focus less on territorial alignment and more on production tables. Aircraft numbers were compared against projected attrition rates. Shipbuilding schedules were revised according to recent convoy losses. Fuel reserves were calculated against estimated operational demand across Navy, Air Force, and civilian sectors. Aircraft production received particular attention. Factories in the Midlands and southern England operated in coordinated sequences, each responsible for sections of fuselage, engine components, or final assembly. Delivery reports moved weekly between manufacturing boards and the Air Ministry. The numbers were examined alongside combat reports. If fighter losses in a given month exceeded output, the difference was recorded as a deficit requiring correction. Adjustments followed in the form of extended shifts, redistribution of skilled labor, and reallocation of raw materials, such as aluminum and high-grade steel. The system functioned through incremental correction rather than sweeping change. Managers submitted memoranda detailing bottlenecks in engine machining or delays in propeller supply. Railway timetables were altered to prioritize transport of aircraft parts between dispersed facilities. When air raids disrupted a factory, production was temporarily redistributed to satellite workshops. The objective remained steady continuity. Each completed aircraft was entered into inventory lists, assigned to squadrons, and integrated into maintenance cycles. Shipbuilding presented a parallel challenge. Merchant vessels lost to submarine attack required replacement at a rate that matched or exceeded sinkings. Shipyards along the Clyde, Tyne, and Mersey tracked keel layings and launch dates with precise accounting. Steel plate deliveries were scheduled months in advance. Labor shortages emerged as skilled shipwrights were drawn into naval service or transferred to other essential industries. Training programs for new workers expanded, though productivity during apprenticeship remained lower than experienced standards. Convoy statistics were studied with equal attention. Admiralty reports listed tonnage sunk per month, routes affected, and escort availability. Each figure informed adjustments in convoy size and routing. Destroyers and corvettes assigned to escort duty operated on compressed maintenance schedules. Repair docks calculated turnaround times in days rather than weeks. Fuel allocation to escort vessels required coordination with refinery output and import schedules. Fuel itself formed a separate ledger of concern. Britain possessed limited domestic oil production and depended largely on overseas supply. Tankers arriving from the Caribbean and the Middle East were integrated into convoy systems vulnerable to interception. Storage facilities near major ports maintained reserve levels calculated to sustain military operations for defined periods. Consumption estimates for the Royal Air Force, Royal Navy, and mechanized Army units were projected quarterly. Any deviation in import volume required recalibration of distribution. Coal remained central to industrial continuity. Mines in Wales and northern England operated under expanded quotas. Rail transport carried coal to power stations and steelworks, which in turn supported armament production. Interruptions in rail capacity, whether from mechanical failure or air damage, required immediate administrative response. Redundancies were introduced where possible, though duplication consumed additional resources. Labor allocation became an administrative task of increasing complexity. As enlistment drew younger workers into uniform, factories relied more heavily on older employees and women entering industrial roles. Government departments maintained registries to track available manpower and assign individuals according to priority sectors. Memoranda circulated identifying shortages in toolmaking, welding, and precision machining. Adjustments were recorded in incremental percentages rather than broad declarations. Financial management intersected with these calculations. Treasury officials monitored expenditure on raw materials, overseas procurement, and domestic wages. Currency reserves influenced purchasing power abroad. Agreements with allied governments facilitated material exchange, though shipping capacity limited volume. The balance between import requirement and convoy protection formed a recurring subject of cabinet review. Throughout these processes, the documentation accumulated. Tables compared monthly output across aircraft models. Graphs plotted merchant tonnage built against tonnage lost. Fuel reserve levels were expressed in weeks of projected consumption. These records did not emphasize morale or rhetoric. They established measurable indicators by which planners judged sustainability. Air defense required not only aircraft production, but also maintenance infrastructure. Replacement parts, engine overhauls, and trained ground crews formed part of the same arithmetic. If an aircraft remained grounded awaiting components, its absence affected operational totals as surely as combat loss. Depots expanded storage capacity to ensure rapid distribution. Training programs for mechanics increased throughput, though the experience gap persisted. In shipyards, standardized designs were introduced to accelerate construction. Simplified cargo vessels reduced build time while maintaining essential carrying capacity. The decision reflected calculation. Shorter production cycles could offset higher risk of loss. Efficiency was measured in days saved per hull and tons transported per voyage. These interconnected systems created a pattern in which Britain's survival appeared as a function of sustained curves rather than singular victories. If aircraft output exceeded losses, air defense capacity stabilized. If shipbuilding approximated convoy sinkings, supply continuity endured. If fuel imports matched consumption, naval and air operations could proceed without reduction. The narrowing strategic depth described in earlier months now translated directly into production requirements. With continental bases unavailable, all reinforcement originated domestically. Industrial districts carried the weight once distributed across Allied territories. The margin for error contracted. Each delayed shipment or damaged facility reduced the buffer between requirement and availability. Yet daily operations continued according to schedule. Factory whistles marked shift changes. Clerks entered figures into ledgers. Dock workers unloaded cargo under regulated lighting. The visible routine of work concealed the precision of the calculations guiding it. Britain's capacity to remain in the war rested not on isolated acts, but on sustained numerical balance maintained across interconnected industries. By late summer 1940, planners could observe trends emerging from accumulated data. Production increases in certain aircraft categories approached projected needs. Shipyard output improved incrementally. Fuel reserves fluctuated within manageable limits. These developments did not eliminate vulnerability, but they defined parameters within which operations could continue. The war's outcome, at this stage, appeared closely aligned with the maintenance of these production curves, measured week by week, shipment by shipment, across an island now fully responsible for its own endurance. As industrial planning intensified, civilian administration expanded in parallel. Adjustments introduced at the level of factory output and convoy routing required corresponding measures across towns and cities. The mechanisms were procedural. Circulars moved from central ministries to local councils, from councils to wardens, from wardens to households. Implementation followed schedules and forms rather than public ceremony. Air raid precautions had existed in outline before open conflict, but their scope widened as the strategic position contracted. Municipal authorities reviewed shelter capacity street by street. Public buildings were surveyed for structural suitability. Basements were reinforced where possible. In residential districts, instructions were distributed describing how to construct small protective enclosures within homes. The materials required were listed plainly: timber, sandbags, corrugated metal sheets. Local suppliers recorded increased demand, and allocation systems were introduced where shortages appeared. Gas mask distribution formed another layer of preparation. Registration centers were established in schools and town halls. Families arrived according to alphabetical order. Masks were fitted, labeled, and issued in cardboard boxes. Instructions accompanied each mask, detailing maintenance and storage. Replacement filters were cataloged in inventory lists. Compliance was recorded through attendance figures rather than inspection campaigns. The presence of a mask became part of daily movement, carried to workplaces and schools without commentary. Blackout regulations altered the appearance of urban space. Street lamps were modified to reduce upward light. Households received guidance on covering windows with heavy fabric or painted paper. Transport authorities installed shielding on vehicle headlights. Enforcement fell to local wardens who patrolled neighborhoods, noting infractions and issuing warnings. The objective was uniformity. A single uncovered window risked visibility from the air. Compliance rates were entered into municipal reports alongside other civil metrics. Rationing emerged gradually from shipping calculations. As convoy losses affected import forecasts, the Ministry of Food introduced controlled distribution of essential goods. Registration with local grocers became mandatory. Each individual received a ration book containing coupons marked by commodity and quantity. Shopkeepers maintained ledgers recording transactions against issued coupons. Supplies were distributed according to standardized allowances, adjusted periodically based on availability. The system relied on arithmetic consistency. Stocks were monitored centrally and redistributed regionally to prevent imbalance. Evacuation schemes followed similar administrative logic. Children in designated urban areas were assigned to relocation categories. Notices informed parents of assembly points and departure times. Trains were scheduled to transport groups to rural districts prepared to receive them. Host households registered spare rooms through local authorities. Billeting officers matched evacuees with available accommodation using lists compiled in advance. The movement unfolded in stages, recorded through passenger counts and arrival confirmations. The emphasis lay on orderly transfer rather than dramatic departure. Transport networks adjusted to new priorities. Railway timetables incorporated military freight alongside civilian travel. Certain routes were rerouted to reduce congestion near strategic facilities. Bus services altered evening schedules to align with blackout restrictions. Signage in stations reflected these changes in neutral language. Commuters adapted to revised departure times and occasional delays, integrating them into routine expectation. Healthcare services expanded capacity within existing frameworks. Hospitals designated auxiliary wards in anticipation of air casualties. Medical supplies were inventoried and stored in distributed depots to mitigate concentrated loss. Training sessions for first aid volunteers were organized through local councils. Attendance lists and certification records track participation. These preparations extended across regions, forming a layered system intended to absorb potential disruption. Education systems incorporated procedural modifications. Schools practiced evacuation drills. Attendance registers noted the transfer of pupils to rural institutions. Curriculum schedules adjusted to accommodate shortened daylight hours under blackout conditions. Teachers maintained administrative correspondence to coordinate records between receiving and originating schools. Continuity of instruction remained an objective, framed within logistical parameters. Food production within Britain received parallel attention. Allotment programs expanded through municipal encouragement. Citizens applied for small plots of land, and seed distribution was organized through agricultural committees. Harvest estimates were reported upward to regional offices. The aim was supplementation rather than replacement of imported supply. Production figures from these local initiatives entered broader calculations of national food security. Throughout these adjustments, official communication retained consistent tone. Government leaflets explained procedures in direct language, outlining steps without speculation. Posters displayed instructions for shelter use or ration compliance. The content emphasized method and participation. Implementation depended on collective adherence to guidelines disseminated through established administrative channels. The visible character of daily life shifted in incremental ways. Streets darkened earlier in the evening. Queues formed at grocers according to delivery schedules. Railway platforms carried groups identified for relocation. Yet these changes emerged through circulars and timetables rather than sudden upheaval. Each measure corresponded to an assessment made elsewhere within government offices where shipping tonnage, aircraft output, and fuel reserves were tabulated. Civilian infrastructure thus became an extension of industrial adjustment. As factories recalibrated output and shipyards tracked losses, households recalibrated consumption and movement. The same principle of balance applied. Ration allowances reflected import projections. Blackout enforcement reflected air defense calculations. Evacuation planning reflected anticipated risk to urban centers tied to industrial concentration. By late 1940, the integration of civilian and industrial planning formed a unified structure oriented toward endurance. Administrative expansion replaced improvisation. Records accumulated at local and national levels, documenting compliance rates, distribution totals, and shelter capacity. The routines of ordinary life continued within a framework increasingly defined by regulation and allocation. Britain's preparation for sustained conflict was therefore visible not through singular events, but through accumulated directives that reshaped daily practice. The adjustment was procedural and continuous. As strategic depth diminished and production demands increased, civilian systems absorbed corresponding responsibilities. The state extended into households through ration books, blackout curtains, and registration forms, establishing a pattern of organized endurance calibrated to the same arithmetic that governed factories and fleets. By June 1940, the French government had requested terms. The armistice formalized a transformation already visible in maps and memoranda. For British planners, the event registered less as a moment of surprise and more as a confirmation of accumulated reports. Diplomatic cables arriving from Bordeaux and later from Vichy outlined administrative arrangements for occupation zones and fleet dispositions. These documents were circulated through the Foreign Office and summarized for the War Cabinet. Their language was restrained. They described territorial divisions, command transfers, and conditions of ceasefire. The practical implications unfolded through operational channels. British liaison officers attached to French formations received instructions to withdraw. Evacuation routes were reviewed once more, this time extending beyond the northern ports used weeks earlier. Western harbors along the Bay of Biscay became points of embarkation. Naval planners calculated distances, fuel requirements, and escort allocations. Merchant vessels previously assigned to convoy duty were redirected temporarily to transport personnel. Passenger lists were compiled according to unit strength and available capacity. Troop formations returning to Britain required redistribution. Units that had operated within a combined Allied structure now reorganized under exclusively British command. Equipment shortages, already noted after earlier evacuations, were itemized in revised inventories. Artillery counts, vehicle numbers, and ammunition stocks were compared against minimum defensive requirements for the home islands. Replacement schedules were extended, reflecting industrial capacity and shipping constraints. Naval redeployments followed immediately, with French Atlantic ports no longer Allied bases. German access to western coastlines expanded. Admiralty charts were amended to reflect potential submarine and surface radar operations from Brest, Lorient, and other harbors. Escort patterns for Atlantic convoys shifted westward to intercept threats earlier in their approach. Destroyer flotillas were reassigned, reducing their availability for secondary duties. Maintenance cycles were compressed to sustain increased operational tempo. The status of the French fleet introduced further calculation. War Cabinet minutes recorded discussions regarding the disposition of vessels anchored in Mediterranean and North African ports. The concern centered on balance of naval power should these ships come under German influence. Communications with French naval commanders sought clarification of intent. Contingency planning proceeded in parallel, structured around tonnage assessments and comparative strength tables. The objective remained preservation of maritime equilibrium. Diplomatic correspondence reflected Britain's altered position. Embassies in neutral capitals transmitted inquiries regarding policy continuity. Trade agreements required revision to account for lost transit routes through French territory. Financial arrangements were recalculated without French participation. The coalition that had defined the war's opening months had contracted to a single principal actor in Western Europe. This reality was entered into briefings not as rhetoric, but as context for decision-making. Defensive lines within Britain were recalibrated accordingly. Coastal sectors were divided into commands responsible for defined stretches of shoreline. Engineering units surveyed beaches and estuaries, identifying points suitable for landing craft. Obstacles were installed where terrain permitted. Anti-aircraft batteries were repositioned to cover likely approach corridors identified through reconnaissance reports. Each adjustment was logged in operational summaries circulated to senior staff. The evacuation process itself extended beyond immediate troop transport. Administrative services relocated records and communications equipment. Supply depots in southern England expanded storage capacity to accommodate returning units. Medical facilities processed injured personnel and updated casualty lists. The movement of men across the channel was mirrored by movement of documentation across ministries. Service numbers were verified, postings reassigned, and training schedules revised. Air defense planning absorbed similar revisions. With airfields across northern France no longer available to friendly forces, the distance between German bases and British targets shortened. Fighter Command adjusted sector boundaries to account for anticipated flight paths. Radar installations along the southern coast were reviewed for coverage gaps. Aircraft production forecasts were cross-referenced with expected operational demand under increased pressure. Economic implications became measurable. Imports once routed through French ports required alternative handling. Insurance assessments for Atlantic shipping rose in response to expanded enemy coastline. Fuel consumption estimates incorporated longer escort distances. The cumulative effect appeared in Treasury summaries comparing expenditure projections before and after the armistice. Within the War Cabinet, notes from successive meetings documented a shift in emphasis. Earlier discussions concerning joint operations with French forces gave way to considerations centered exclusively on British capacity. Minutes referenced manpower totals available for home defense, aircraft production curves, and naval strength relative to potential adversary deployments. The language remained procedural. Decisions were framed as adjustments to existing plans rather than departures from them. The broader public received announcements acknowledging France's new status. These statements avoided elaboration. The practical consequences, however, entered daily life indirectly. Military convoys moved more frequently along British roads. Coastal access in certain areas was restricted for defensive construction. Training exercises expanded across rural districts. Each measure corresponded to assessments recorded elsewhere in administrative files. Britain's strategic isolation thus became quantifiable. The length of hostile-controlled coastline opposite the island increased by hundreds of miles. Submarine transit times to Atlantic shipping lanes decreased. Air approach distances shortened. These changes were entered into planning charts and operational tables. They represented variables requiring compensation through increased patrols, accelerated production, and tighter coordination between services. The midpoint of the year marked a transition from deterioration to sustained strain. Conditions no longer worsened through sudden collapse. Instead, they stabilized at a more demanding level. Britain stood without continental partner in the West. The weight of that position expressed itself through extended naval rotations, heightened aircraft sortie rates, and expanded coastal fortifications. France's defeat, therefore, functioned as a structural turning point. It altered geography, logistics, and diplomatic alignment. Its consequences extended outward into every department responsible for defense and supply. The event did not require dramatic description. Its significance appeared in the steady revision of memoranda, the redrawing of operational maps, and a measurable increase in obligations now carried by a single state positioned at the edge of a continent under opposing control. With continental withdrawal complete and naval redeployments in place, planning shifted toward the possibility of direct assault on the British mainland. The prospect of invasion was no longer treated as a distant contingency. It entered routine discussion within service departments. Memoranda circulated outlining estimated landing zones, tidal conditions along the southern coast, and the carrying capacity of available enemy transport vessels. These assessments were expressed in tables comparing shoreline gradients, beach composition, and proximity to road networks. Coastal defenses expanded accordingly. Engineering units surveyed stretches of shore from Kent to Cornwall, identifying sectors where gradients allowed landing craft to approach at varying tides. Concrete emplacements were constructed at intervals calculated to provide overlapping fields of fire. Anti-tank obstacles were installed along likely exit points from beaches, using steel rails and reinforced blocks positioned according to standardized diagrams. Minefields were mapped and recorded with precise coordinates to prevent accidental interference with friendly patrols. Inland, defensive lines were layered behind the immediate coast. Stop lines followed natural features, such as rivers and ridges. Bridges were prepared for demolition, charges placed but not armed, awaiting authorization protocols defined in sealed orders. Road signs were removed in selected districts to complicate navigation for potential invaders. These measures were cataloged in regional command reports, each noting percentage completion and material requirements outstanding. The Home Guard emerged as a supplementary force within this structure. Enrollment procedures were organized through local authorities. Volunteers registered at municipal offices, providing age, occupation, and prior service history. Units were formed according to district boundaries, assigned to protect infrastructure, including rail junctions, power stations, and waterworks. Equipment distribution progressed in stages, dependent on production output and surplus allocation from regular forces. Training schedules emphasized observation, reporting, and static defense roles rather than maneuver operations. Coordination between regular Army formations and auxiliary units required additional documentation. Command hierarchies were clarified through circulars specifying lines of authority in the event of communication disruption. Signal procedures were standardized. Password systems were distributed through sealed envelopes to be opened under defined conditions. The objective remained continuity of command, even under partial breakdown. Air defense planning intensified in parallel. Radar installations along the coast transmitted continuous data to central filtering stations. Plots of aircraft movement were tracked across boards marked with grid references. Fighter squadrons were assigned readiness levels based on intelligence regarding enemy airfield activity across the channel. Operational research units compiled metrics comparing sortie rates, interception times, and aircraft serviceability percentages. These figures informed decisions regarding dispersal of aircraft across multiple airfields to reduce vulnerability. Military memoranda addressed landing probabilities through comparative analysis. Estimates of available German barges and transport vessels were weighed against tidal windows and required air cover. Reports calculated the minimum air superiority necessary to protect crossing forces from naval interdiction. Casualty projections for both sides were drafted using historical amphibious data and updated intelligence on defensive density. These documents avoided speculation beyond measurable variables. They expressed outcomes as ranges rather than certainties. Naval patrol patterns adjusted once more to incorporate potential invasion corridors. Destroyers and smaller craft maintained readiness within defined response radii from probable landing beaches. Mine-laying operations were expanded in selected offshore sectors, with navigational charts amended accordingly. Communication drills between naval and coastal artillery units were rehearsed to ensure coordinated response within minutes of confirmed sighting. Logistical preparation extended to civilian infrastructure as well. Fuel depots were dispersed inland to reduce the risk of capture. Railway rolling stock was allocated contingency schedules for rapid troop movement toward threatened sectors. Warehouses near the coast limited storage quantities to prevent significant loss in the event of seizure. These measures were integrated into broader defensive calculations, each adjustment recorded through departmental correspondence. Intelligence assessments contributed additional variables. Aerial reconnaissance photographs of French ports identified concentrations of barges and small craft. Analysts measured their dimensions and estimated carrying capacity. Weather patterns across the channel were studied to determine feasible crossing periods. Reports were distributed daily, appended with annotations indicating degree of confidence in each source. The recognition of invasion possibility did not alter tone within official communication. It altered frequency. Meetings of the chiefs of staff occurred at shorter intervals. Situation summaries were updated more often. The War Cabinet reviewed consolidated reports combining naval, military, and air data into unified projections. Each department contributed figures reflecting its own readiness status and anticipated strain under sustained engagement. Training within regular units emphasized rapid deployment to assign defensive sectors. Exercises simulated coastal breach scenarios, requiring units to mobilize from barracks to prepared positions within defined time limits. Performance was measured in hours and minutes. Deficiencies were noted for correction. Ammunition reserves were recalculated against projected engagement duration. The cumulative effect of these preparations reflected an understanding that Britain's position had entered a new phase. Isolation had converted theoretical planning into immediate readiness. The island's defense depended upon coordination between systems operating at full extension: radar detection, fighter interception, naval interdiction, coastal artillery response, and ground resistance. Britain's future in these calculations rested partly on factors beyond direct control: weather conditions over the channel, enemy command decisions, and the timing of operations initiated elsewhere. Yet within the scope of domestic authority, every measurable element was cataloged and adjusted. Production curves intersected with troop deployment charts. Radar coverage overlapped with artillery range diagrams. Volunteer rosters aligned with infrastructure maps. The inevitability did not express itself through alarm. It appeared in the density of documentation and the expansion of defensive layers across the landscape. Fields near the coast contained obstacles positioned according to blueprint. Church halls stored equipment for auxiliary units. Operations rooms displayed continuous updates of aerial activity. The island prepared to stand alone through organized integration of its remaining assets, each component linked to the next in anticipation of an event that planning now treated as plausible rather than hypothetical. By late summer 1940, the air campaign over southern England developed into a sustained contest measured less by individual engagements than by cumulative totals. Each day generated operational summaries listing sorties flown, aircraft lost, aircraft repaired, and pilots available for duty. These figures were transmitted from sector stations to fighter command headquarters, where they were consolidated into comparative tables. The emphasis rested on balance. If operational strength could be maintained above a defined threshold, defensive coverage would continue. If losses exceeded replacement, gaps would appear. Sortie numbers fluctuated according to weather and enemy activity. Clear days produced higher engagement rates. Cloud cover reduced visibility and limited interception opportunities. Radar detection provided early warning, allowing squadrons to be scrambled in calculated sequence. Controllers monitored fuel consumption and ordered returns before reserves fell below safe margins. Each sortie required inspection upon landing. Ground crews examined engines, repaired minor damage, and prepared aircraft for subsequent deployment. Turnaround times were recorded to evaluate efficiency. Aircraft replacement depended on factory output integrated with transport schedules. Newly assembled fighters left manufacturing plants by rail or air transfer, arriving at maintenance units for final checks before assignment to squadrons. Delivery rates were compared weekly against recorded losses. In some periods, output matched or slightly exceeded attrition. In others, concentrated enemy attacks reduced operational strength more rapidly than replenishment could compensate. The margin between available aircraft and minimum defensive requirement narrowed and widened in small increments. Pilot availability formed a separate calculation. Training programs expanded during preceding months, yet the time required to prepare a combat-ready pilot limited immediate reinforcement. Operational training units processed new entrants through defined hours of flight instruction and gunnery practice. Graduation numbers were entered into monthly summaries. Casualty reports listed killed, wounded, and missing personnel. Fatigue emerged as a measurable factor, reflected in medical evaluations and reduced sortie endurance among experienced pilots. Airfield functionality influenced deployment patterns. Enemy bombing targeted runways, hangars, and maintenance facilities. Damage reports categorized airfields according to operational status: fully functional, partially serviceable, or temporarily closed. Repair units filled craters, restored lighting systems, and replaced damaged equipment under time constraints measured in hours. The objective remained restoration of sortie capacity before subsequent attacks. Sector commanders adjusted squadron basing in response to damage, redistributing aircraft across remaining fields to preserve coverage. Attrition extended beyond aircraft and personnel to material infrastructure. Radar masts required maintenance after near misses. Communication lines were rerouted when severed. Fuel storage at airfields demanded protection against secondary explosions. Each component of the system required monitoring to prevent cumulative degradation. Enemy strategy shifted across phases of the campaign. Early concentration on coastal shipping and radar installations gave way to attacks on sector airfields. Intelligence assessments attempted to identify patterns in targeting. Analysts compared reconnaissance reports with operational losses to determine whether pressure focused on specific regions. These findings informed allocation of reserves and repair crews. Statistical reviews at headquarters presented the campaign in columns and percentages. Operational strength was defined as aircraft immediately serviceable and pilots fit for duty. Reserve strength included machines awaiting minor repair and pilots in short rest periods. Graphs plotted daily totals against projected requirements for repelling invasion attempts. The relationship between air superiority and amphibious feasibility appeared repeatedly in staff papers. If fighter coverage diminished significantly, enemy transport across the channel would face reduced opposition. Maintenance cycles required precise coordination. Engines reached defined flight hour limits requiring overhaul. Replacement parts, including propellers and control surfaces, were distributed from central depots according to priority lists. Ground crews worked extended shifts, though labor hours were tracked to prevent decline in quality. Each repaired aircraft returned to operational count, contributing incrementally to the overall balance. Pilot rotation policies attempted to mitigate fatigue. Squadrons were withdrawn northward for brief rest when pressure allowed. Replacement units filled vacated sectors. These movements were documented to ensure continuity of defense coverage. Medical officers reported on physical strain, while commanders assessed performance metrics, including interception success rates and navigational accuracy. Throughout the campaign, public communication described engagements in general terms. Internally, assessments remained numerical. Daily losses were compared with weekly production totals. The ratio between aircraft destroyed and enemy losses was analyzed without emphasis on individual narratives. Success was defined as maintaining sufficient strength to continue operations the following day. As September progressed, changes in enemy targeting patterns influenced operational tempo. Increased bombing of urban areas altered sortie distribution, but did not eliminate pressure on airfields entirely. Fighter command recalculated defensive sectors accordingly. Operational margins remained narrow. On certain days, available aircraft approached minimum levels required for comprehensive coverage. Subsequent deliveries or successful repair efforts restored modest buffers. The cumulative effect of sustained operations manifested in gradual depletion balanced by steady replacement. Survival depended on preserving this equilibrium. If operational strength could be sustained at or above required thresholds, invasion planning by the adversary would remain uncertain. If air superiority could not be achieved by the attacking force, large-scale crossing operations would carry prohibitive risk. By autumn's onset, the data reflected continued functionality of the defensive system. Aircraft numbers remained within calculated parameters. Pilot training outputs, though strained, compensated for losses sufficiently to maintain squadron composition. Airfields, despite repeated damage, returned to service through organized repair efforts. The campaign thus unfolded as a sequence of calculations rather than singular confrontations. Each sortie contributed to a ledger balancing attrition against replacement. Victory was not declared in proclamations within operational reports. Instead, survival was measured in the maintenance of operational totals above critical minimums. As long as those figures held, the feasibility of invasion diminished proportionally. The island's defense remained intact, not through isolated engagements, but through sustained preservation of measurable capacity across weeks of continuous strain. By the closing months of 1940, the arithmetic of military endurance extended beyond aircraft and shipping into financial ledgers. The cost of sustained production, overseas procurement, and maritime transport accumulated against reserves that were not unlimited. Treasury officials compiled statements detailing gold holdings, foreign exchange balances, and outstanding liabilities. These reports circulated alongside operational summaries, linking financial capacity to military sustainability. Britain had long relied on international trade conducted in sterling, supported by gold reserves and overseas investments. As the war expanded, payments for munitions, raw materials, and food increasingly required settlement in dollars, particularly for purchases from the United States. American neutrality legislation imposed legal boundaries on transactions. Goods could be sold on a cash-and-carry basis, meaning payment had to be immediate and transport arranged without American naval involvement. This framework placed direct pressure on Britain's dollar reserves. Correspondence between the Treasury in London and financial representatives in Washington outlined the rate at which balances were declining. Monthly expenditure on aircraft, machine tools, oil, and agricultural products was compared against available assets. Gold shipments were authorized to settle accounts, transferred discreetly across the Atlantic under naval escort. Each transfer reduced the stock held in reserve. Officials recorded the remaining quantity in precise figures, projecting how many months of purchasing power remained under existing consumption rates. British investments in the United States were gradually liquidated to sustain procurement. Securities were sold to generate dollars. The process required coordination with financial institutions and adherence to American regulatory procedures. Reports detailed proceeds, realized, and outstanding holdings yet to be converted. The conversion was not symbolic. It was arithmetic. Once assets were exhausted, further purchases would require alternative arrangements. American law constrained direct credit extension to belligerents. Treasury memoranda analyzed statutory language to determine permissible flexibility. Discussions between British envoys and American officials examined potential reinterpretations of neutrality provisions. Notes from these meetings emphasized legal phrasing rather than political sentiment. The question was whether material support could continue without immediate cash settlement. Simultaneously, domestic expenditure increased. Industrial expansion required capital outlays for factory construction and equipment procurement. Government borrowing rose to finance these programs. War bonds were issued to absorb private savings and estate funding. Interest obligations were calculated against projected tax revenues. Budget forecasts extended into subsequent fiscal years, estimating deficits under various operational scenarios. Shipping losses compounded financial strain. Each merchant vessel sunk represented not only lost cargo, but lost capital investment. Replacement construction demanded steel, labor, and financing. Insurance rates for Atlantic voyages increased, raising transport costs per ton. These increments were entered into balance sheets alongside procurement payments. The linkage between solvency and endurance became explicit in internal communication. If dollar reserves reached depletion before alternative mechanisms were established, procurement from American factories would halt or diminish sharply. Aircraft orders placed months earlier required stage payments. Machine tools essential for expanding British production lines depended on continued import. Fuel purchases for naval operations were similarly tied to dollar availability. Statistical projections illustrated narrowing margins. Charts compared remaining gold holdings against anticipated monthly expenditure at current operational tempo. Scenarios modeled reduced purchasing rates, identifying which categories of import could be curtailed with minimal strategic consequence. These exercises resembled earlier production calculations, substituting financial units for aircraft totals. Diplomatic cables from Washington described evolving debate within the American administration. Legal advisors examined options for modifying existing frameworks without formal entry into war. British officials documented these discussions carefully, aware that timing affected solvency calculations. Each month of sustained procurement reduced reserves further. Domestic rationing and industrial efficiency thus intersected with foreign exchange management. Reduced civilian consumption lowered import requirements marginally, conserving dollars. Expanded domestic production of certain materials decreased reliance on foreign suppliers. Treasury memoranda acknowledged these savings, though they did not offset the scale of military purchasing abroad. The strain manifested not in public declarations, but in confidential assessments circulated among senior ministers. Tables displayed projected exhaustion dates under varying expenditure assumptions. Notes appended to these tables referenced ongoing diplomatic efforts to secure revised purchasing terms. The tone remained measured. Financial depletion was treated as a variable requiring administrative solution rather than public alarm. Britain's capacity to continue resistance, therefore, depended on dual balances: operational strength and financial solvency. Aircraft production could remain steady, convoys could reach port, and defensive systems could function effectively. Yet if payment mechanisms failed, the flow of essential materials would contract regardless of military readiness. By early 1941, the convergence of these calculations became evident. Gold reserves had declined significantly from pre-war levels. Dollar balances approached thresholds previously identified in Treasury projections. The continuation of procurement at existing scale required structural change in financial arrangement with the United States. The narrative of endurance thus shifted subtly from factories and airfields to vaults and account ledgers. Survival appeared contingent not solely upon repelling invasion or maintaining air superiority, but upon sustaining the economic instruments that enabled production itself. Exhaustion, in this context, meant depletion of credit and currency rather than defeat on a battlefield. The question before policymakers was whether financial mechanisms could be adapted quickly enough to prevent material shortage from undermining resistance already maintained through months of calculated strain. By the opening months of 1941, information from London arrived in Washington through formal channels. Ambassadors transmitted daily reports detailing military operations, shipping losses, and the status of financial reserves. Economic summaries accompanied these communications, quantifying gold holdings, dollar balances, and projected import needs. Intelligence briefings added estimates of German air strength, shipping threats, and operational readiness. Each document was cataloged and forwarded to appropriate departments, where clerks recorded, cross-referenced, and summarized the incoming data. The process emphasized accuracy and continuity, with particular attention to figures that could be measured against American statutory limits and resource availability. President Franklin Roosevelt received these reports not as dramatic warnings, but as accumulations of administrative fact. Daily briefings included tables showing Britain's declining dollar reserves, projected months of sustainable procurement, and the potential impact of disrupted shipping lanes. Comparisons between aircraft output, convoy losses, and financial holdings allowed calculations of the minimum thresholds required to maintain resistance. Observers noted that if Britain's access to material support faltered, the possibility of negotiation with Germany could no longer be excluded. The realization emerged gradually, reflected in annotated memoranda rather than public statements. Within the administration, legal considerations shaped every discussion. Neutrality legislation constrained the provision of arms and material. Officials compiled memos reviewing permissible transactions under existing law, specifying conditions for cash payments, credit extensions, and transfer of war material. Congress remained cautious. Correspondence from committee chairs indicated concern for both legal precedent and domestic opinion. Public sentiment, measured through polling and media analysis, was monitored continuously, with reports circulated to inform policy decisions without causing public alarm. Incremental adjustments began to appear in policy planning. Destroyers for bases agreements were drafted with exactitude. Numbers of vessels, locations of base transfers, timelines for completion, and procedural requirements for Senate approval were all detailed in sequential memoranda. Each step required coordination between the Navy, State Department, and Treasury, ensuring that every movement of resources complied with existing legal frameworks. Operational consequences were calculated through tables listing port capacity, crew requirements, and support facilities, reflecting the procedural nature of the transaction. Beyond these initial measures, proposals for expanded material support were structured systematically. Requests for additional munitions, aircraft, and ships were prepared with accompanying cost projections and delivery schedules. Treasury and logistics officers evaluated dollar balances and export capacity. Departmental memoranda outlined potential bottlenecks, risks of diversion at sea, and measures to mitigate disruption. Each recommendation proceeded through internal review before receiving authorization for execution. The conceptual foundation of what would become Lend-Lease emerged in the same procedural fashion. Draft documents specified categories of goods eligible for transfer, conditions for repayment or return, and mechanisms for tracking shipments. Legal counsel reviewed statutes to ensure compliance. Budget offices calculated fiscal impact, noting both immediate expenditure and projected long-term effects. Intelligence assessments quantified the strategic necessity of continued material support to Britain in relation to potential invasion, air superiority, and industrial output. Roosevelt's orders followed established administrative procedures. Instructions were transmitted to the War and Navy departments, specifying quantities, routes, and schedules. Coordination memos were circulated to ensure port readiness, crew availability, and secure transport. Delivery timetables were cross-checked against production outputs in American factories. Every adjustment was documented, from the allocation of a single bomber to the construction of storage facilities at naval bases. The scale was large, yet the process retained the same measured, procedural character as internal memoranda in London. Throughout this period, incremental realization governed American policy. No sudden declaration or dramatic announcement altered the course of action. Each decision emerged from analysis, whether dollar balances could cover sustained procurement, how legal constraints could be navigated, and how domestic opinion could be managed without provoking backlash. The cumulative effect, however, was considerable. Destroyers were exchanged for base rights. Shipments of material increased in volume, and the framework for continued assistance formalized, all through successive adjustments rather than public proclamation. The chain of calculation extended from British ledgers of aircraft production and financial reserves to American memoranda, analyzing legality, fiscal capacity, and logistical feasibility. Each piece of data influenced subsequent decisions. Tables in Washington reflected figures arriving from London, juxtaposed with domestic production capacities, shipping schedules, and political constraints. Adjustments were recorded in spreadsheets, margin calculations, and procedural notes. The narrative of policy grew from arithmetic and administration rather than rhetoric. By mid-1941, the process had established a new operational reality. Britain's capacity to sustain resistance now relied on an international extension of administrative coordination. Material support flowed through channels authorized under precise legal and financial conditions. Memoranda documented every transaction, every shipment, and every adjustment to planned delivery schedules. Roosevelt's influence manifested through instructions to subordinate departments and carefully monitored execution rather than through public declaration. The structural pressure extended beyond Britain itself. Financial strain, operational endurance, and industrial output in London became interconnected with bureaucratic processes in Washington. Each procedural adjustment in the United States reinforced the possibility of continued resistance across the Atlantic. The consequences of inaction were measured in declining inventories, reduced aircraft deliveries, and cumulative shortfall in essential resources. Intervention, in this framework, grew directly from calculation, measured need, available capacity, and legal allowance, rather than impulse or sentiment. By the summer of 1941, the outlines of sustained assistance were clear. Destroyers had been transferred, shipments of aircraft and munitions were scheduled according to factory output, and the administrative machinery of Lend-Lease had begun to take shape. The campaign of support proceeded through calculated increments, each step documented in memoranda, correspondence, and financial ledgers. Britain's survival now depended on systems that extended across oceans, linking operational endurance to economic calculation, legal frameworks, and coordinated policy. The inevitability remained quiet but measurable. Without these mechanisms, continued resistance would become impossible, not through direct attack, but through exhaustion of resources. By the autumn of 1941, the patterns that had emerged over the previous months had begun to stabilize. American shipments of aircraft, tanks, and raw materials arrived according to schedules laid out in memoranda and shipping manifests. Factories in Britain adjusted output to match available resources rather than projected ambition. Production curves leveled, measured in completed aircraft, engines, and artillery pieces. Ground crews, engineers, and dock workers maintained a steady rhythm, sustaining operational capacity within predictable margins. Each delivery reinforced systems already in place, reducing pressure on emergency improvisation. The immediate threat of invasion receded as German attention shifted toward the east. Planning documents still identified probable landing sites and force concentrations across the Channel, but intelligence reports indicated that a substantial portion of the Luftwaffe and Army resources were committed elsewhere. Coastal defenses remained staffed and maintained, obstacles preserved, and home guard units stationed according to prearranged sectors. The measures established earlier were not dismantled. They remained in place, functioning as part of a comprehensive pattern of endurance rather than a response to imminent assault. Civilian routines adapted to this extended framework. Rationing continued according to previously established schedules. Blackout regulations persisted through evenings, enforced with the same attention to uniformity and coverage as in prior months. Evacuation drills and emergency procedures remained part of public awareness, though they were embedded within daily life rather than signaling immediate crisis. Families, workers, and schools operated within these constraints, calibrating consumption, travel, and labor to the conditions defined by administrative planning. Within military administration, operational capacity was sustained rather than expanded. Fighter squadrons remained at functional strength. Naval escorts followed scheduled rotations. Repair and maintenance cycles proceeded according to established timelines. Sortie rates, convoy departures, and logistical throughput were recorded in tables, compared against projected requirements, and used to refine planning without reliance on sudden action or improvisation. The island maintained its ability to respond, not through dramatic confrontation, but through sustained application of systems and measurements. The effects of American assistance remained tangible but procedural. Shipments arrived in predetermined sequences, accompanied by documentation detailing tonnage, contents, and intended deployment. Factory schedules incorporated these materials into production plans with minimal deviation. The coordination between transatlantic supply and domestic output exemplified the integration of planning, accounting, and logistics. Roosevelt's prior instructions, executed through bureaucratic channels, had created an extended network of support rather than a single decisive intervention. Risk was redistributed, extending Britain's endurance but not eliminating threat. Financial calculations stabilized in parallel. Dollar reserves, gold holdings, and anticipated expenditure were monitored continuously. Procurement was planned to maintain operational continuity rather than expansion beyond sustainable limits. Treasury reports projected months of material availability, with contingency plans incorporated in case of shipping disruption. The economy, while constrained, balanced domestic consumption, industrial output, and international procurement in a system of ongoing adjustment. In this environment, survival was measured in continuity. Britain had not achieved absolute security. Instead, time had been extended. Air superiority over southern England was maintained at levels sufficient to deter invasion. Naval convoys crossed the Atlantic under escort. Factories, docks, and infrastructure operated at predictable capacity. Administrative routines, rather than sudden decisions or battlefield victories, ensured that the island's defenses remained functional. The structural stability established in these months laid the groundwork for future campaigns. Logistical experience accumulated through convoy coordination informed Atlantic operations. Industrial output permitted preparation for North African campaigns, allowing troop deployment and material support over extended distances. The ability to maintain aircraft and naval strength in sustained operations created conditions under which eventual continental return would become feasible. Each element, production, supply, training, and coordination, functioned as part of a system extended across oceans and maintained through disciplined administration. Britain's position at this stage was therefore a hinge point. The island had endured immediate collapse, maintained essential systems, and integrated external support into domestic operations. Its survival was neither celebrated nor dramatized. It was recorded in operational summaries, financial tables, and maintenance reports. Risk persisted, but the margin for managed endurance had expanded. The story of this period concludes not with resolution, but with continuity. Routines continued, measurements persisted, and administrative oversight ensured the functioning of both military and civilian systems. Time, extended through careful coordination and sustained effort, became the defining factor. Britain remained at the edge of the continent, its survival maintained through procedural rigor, integrated support, and the quiet operation of countless interdependent systems. From this extended baseline, future campaigns could emerge, made possible by the structural stability painstakingly established over months of calculated effort.